All right. So thank you, Alexa, for joining us today. This is a class that I was supposed to be teaching in person, but because of my conference travel, I should be actually flying at the time it is supposed to be taking place. So thank you for stepping in and agreeing to have a conversation with me about the Comintern and transnational communism during the interwar period. Would you mind starting by telling a couple of words about yourself and about your research to let my students kind of better understand whom they're dealing with today?
Of course. So I am Professor Oleksa Drachewych. I am mainly based at Western University, but also teach at King's University College, an affiliated college of Western, and also the University of Guelph. I specialize in the Comintern and Soviet foreign policy. So I've authored a book, The Communist International, Anti-Imperialism and Racial Equality in British Dominions. And I'm also the co-editor of Left Transnationalism, which is a collection that takes a transnational approach to those same questions. I'm also working on a book that is looking at the global impact of the Bolshevik Revolution through the guise of the international communist movement and trying to almost reshift sort of how do we tell the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, not from the Soviet Union, but from the perspective of the movement that it developed. And at some point, that project will see the light of day, but as the last few years have been challenging with the pandemic and whatnot, that's gotten a little bit of a pause, but still working on that. But that's sort of the quick summary of where I've specialized in. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And with the disruption in travel, not only caused by COVID, but now by war, kind of things related to working in Russian archive are not going to be easier. Luckily, I think the entire Comintern archive is digitized and available online.
A good chunk of it is about there's some disagreement about how much, but roughly 1 million of the most quote important files are available that way. But the one good thing is that a lot of the individual sort of national archives, so Canada has it, Australia has it, etc. They actually managed to make agreements with our Gatsby, or sorry, its precursor in the 90s, to have those collections available. The only challenge with working with them is if you want to take photographs of them, you need permission of the Russian government to do so, or the Russian archives to do so. So the problem is that they're available, they're just still somewhat inaccessible if you're not ready to basically try to take everything down right then. But they're usually actually complete records. So the Canadian Communist Party records are, at least from the Comintern's perspective, are available in Ottawa, for example. So there are opportunities to do it. To do this history still, even with if travel to Russia or researching in Russia might be unlikely or difficult.
Yeah, I think for at least the next 7 to 10 years, that might be a problem, unless we see dramatic changes.
Yeah.
And it just came to me that in this way we do share some common research ground, because my first book was on the immigration of Finnish Canadians and Finnish Americans to Soviet Karelia during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and the kind of overall framework within which that immigration took place was indeed partially Comintern, partially the Comintern kind of connections, as well as other transnational communist, more kind of ethnic-oriented, more national-oriented, between kind of different Finnish communist organizations. But kind of nevertheless, we'll see if we overlap more during this conversation. But what about, for the sake of, again, my students better understanding what we're going to talk about, let's kind of discuss the very basic thing. What was Comintern?
Yeah. So the easy answer is the Comintern was the, and I'm always hesitant to put this, the Bolsheviks' method to organize sort of world revolution in the international communist movement. I say I'm hesitant to say the Bolsheviks because I'm of the opinion that we need to give more credit to some of the other delegates. But for most, that would be an uncontroversial statement to say this was Lenin, the Zimmerwald left, the Bolshevik Party's way of essentially taking what they did like about the Second International and basically giving them a leadership position. The Bolsheviks are the only successful communist revolutionary, so they use this and leverage this, plus a number of communists, radicals, revolutionaries. They flock to Bolshevik Russia and try to learn from them. So They take this sort of after coming out of the First World War, where Lenin famously basically sees it as the Second International as ideologically bankrupt, as all of the individual socialist parties break off and focus on their own individual war efforts. And the Comintern is his and the Bolshevik Party's way of trying to just bring back that body that can actually lead to communism succeeding. So it has a number of different tendrils. One of the main ones is that it helps fund the starting and the foundation of a number of communist parties. It provides sort of a common set of tactics. The congresses and plenums develop into forums in which, at least initially, there is some free-flowing debate, to use the term of Alexander Rabinowitz. And this slowly, the question that a lot of, at least historians have, is to what extent was it tied to Soviet foreign policy? Because it's really its ideological wing.
Yeah, and in this sense, can we say that the goals of the Comintern were twofold? On the one hand, the general goal was indeed the advancement of the communists in general through the support of local communist parties, labor movements, even sometimes cooperatives, like the Finnish cooperatives throughout North America. On the other hand, it did pursue this kind of more particular goal of rallying international support for the Soviet Union, right? The first socialist state.
Yeah, so there's so on one hand, you're like to see this as this way of like there's a genuine desire, and that's one thing that I think even if you take the most cynical view of the Comintern, where it's just a tool of the Bolsheviks to gain influence or allies or what have you, is the people who join it. Many of them deeply believe in the movement. I don't think the idea of seeing them as useless dupes is accurate or helpful. And I think that's one thing that is that a number of the people, especially who come to the earlier ones, genuinely believe this is the start of a new way of looking at the world, of developing state structures, of developing nationalist politics and developing into an internationalist politics. On the other hand, it is very much a cultural diplomatic approach to sort of dealing with interactions with the West, interactions with others. And what ends up happening is Comintern events. So to give one that we might get to a little bit later in more detail, the League Against Imperialism, which is a front organization. So what that means is the Comintern says, we want to have an organization that will, for example, be on an issue we think is important, in this case, anti-imperialism. So we're going to fund it, but not openly make it communist. So this is a way to get non-communists involved, and this is particularly notable during the United Front period, roughly 1921 to 1928, and then the Popular Front period with the Spanish Civil War takes a similar approach. And what these front organizations would then do is that they would slowly sort of build these alliances. Well, what they would often then do is invite people afterwards, come to Moscow, come to Leningrad, see the great Mecca we are building. And this is how you then see a number of people start to get sort of brought into at least the Comintern or the communist sort of milieu, seeing what's happening there and things like this. And this is where it's like one of the things that I've been, for example, focusing on is anti-imperial radicals. People like Jomo Kenyatta, who no one really realized had that much connection to communist circles, was invited to go back to Moscow. And we see a number of these figures like this, that they come to these meetings, end up in Moscow, or end up at least in circles that are linked to Moscow, and therefore they're sold on communism or communist ideals or ways of organizing or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, speaking of enthusiasm, when the government of Soviet Karelia, which is part of the Soviet Union at the time, right, but has certain autonomous rights, when they're looking to recruit Finns, like Finnish-speaking Americans and Canadians, and they use their own networks, but also the Comintern to, announce this call for applications. Who wants to go to Soviet Karelia and help build communism? Believe it or not, they end up receiving close to 100,000 applications. And in the end, they only choose to kind of pick 6,500 people to actually move. But the kind of response was overwhelming. People did believe in international communism. People did look to, change something in their lives. So I think the Comintern was an organization that appeared in the right time at the right place.
Yep. Yeah, and world events also helped the Popular Front, or sorry, not Popular Front, the class against class period, the third period, 28 to 35. The Great Depression proves to be the greatest propaganda tool for the Soviet Union and the Comintern.
Hmm.
That's a period where a number of individuals start to believe communism might be the way. A number of individuals also start seeing fascism as the way as well. But you have, like, during that period, that's a time period where the Comintern actually goes to great pains to try to bring non-white delegates, so particularly delegates either from Central Asia, the Middle East, but especially Black Americans. And so they do a really strong push of trying to, they essentially even have quotas where they're telling parties, please send this many people, because by that point, they're starting to focus more on basically rallying any oppressed group behind the communist banner. And so by the late 20s and early 30s, one of the biggest places they're focusing on is racial inequality, and particularly segregation in the South. And they made great inroads with regards to some of the southern chapters of the American Communist Party. But this is also why you then have a greater push for things like the Native Republic thesis, the Black Belt thesis, where they will push for independence for the Black African population in South Africa, or the Black American population, but in the southern United States. But what they're also doing is they're saying, have them come to the Soviet Union. They can see we have this society without racism. Now, granted, they would often have it sort of the Potemkin village idea of they don't see everything, and they still have to deal with just the exoticization they would
Hmm.
see from Soviet citizens. But again, they're not being persecuted solely based off their race, and so this then this allows them to use that cultural diplomatic those transnational networks to say, look, there is no racism here, and it's something that continues today as one of those holdovers from that, even though it's a much more complicated phenomenon.
Hmm. Hmm. One of our classes that had already taken place was on Soviet medical care, how the
Mhm.
Soviet Union, on the one hand, tries to build this universal healthcare system. On the other hand, very, intentionally uses it to appeal to the international community, to show them, we're called socialists or communists for a reason. We do provide these kind of medical care as a universal right. We do
Mhm.
treat it as a right and not as a privilege. So yeah, there is this sort of going back and forth. But since we kind of describe the Comintern as that being an important thing of the interwar period, uh, we might probably need to speak more explicitly about its structure. So how was it structured?
So the best way to put it is bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy. So it very much follows in some ways the Soviet state structure. So you have an executive committee. It was supposed to be, at least initially, not solely Bolshevik populated, that it would have representatives from other countries. In fact, the center for the Comintern was not supposed to be Moscow. It was actually supposed to rotate to
Mhm.
different cities as presumably the world revolution would happen. This doesn't happen, and instead becomes very firmly entrenched in the Soviet Union, in Moscow. And the ECCI, the Executive Committee of the Communist International, is very much also very Bolshevik heavy. There are then a series of then bodies underneath it. So basically, you then have various bureaucracies that deal with specific regions. So there's the Anglo-American Secretariat, there's the Western European Secretariat, there, et cetera, et cetera. These change over time too. So you have them only operating for a few years before they then get merged into a new one, and it sort of keeps going, keeps evolving throughout the entire period. Beyond that, you then have a plenum and a Congress structure, which is how most delegates would then interact. But what you also have is through this bureaucracy. So let's just take the Western European Bureau. You would have delegates who are basically sent by the individual member parties, usually European, who are then basically populating this bureaucracy and in many of these important positions. So this is why you'll see, for example, you'll often see Finnish communists, British communists, French communists, Italian communists populate so much of this. They're right there, but it's also travel's not too bad. But it's also on top of this is there's always a degree of Eurocentrism in the Comintern as well that we can also talk about a bit later too. What you then have beyond that is a series of training schools. So the International Lenin Schools, the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, et cetera, where these are essentially training schools to bring in communists from around the world or members of the parties to teach them how to be proper revolutionaries. And this is where a number of key leaders actually sort of cut their teeth, and when the third period happens in 28, 29, a number of them actually gain in a number of their member parties because they have the training. So you have that, and then you have other sort of shadow ministries. I'll put it that for lack of a better term. The OMS, the International Liaison Department, for example, which we still to this day don't know a whole lot about. This is the money, the financier aspect of the bureaucracy, plus the potential espionage aspect, plus the how closely related was the NKVD. There's a belief that by 35, the NKVD and the OMS were essentially one and the same. No one really knows what. We believe that we'll never see access to these documents because that's the collection everyone wants to get their hands on, because that's how you'll be able to track how the money is sent around, how you'll be able to track how, to what extent was the Comintern a spy network, things like this. And so that's also sort of there at the side where their role is essentially to make sure communist parties have the money to print materials, to pay their members, what have you. So again, this is a major operation. At the same time, to just show some of the weird links, while there's this massive bureaucracy, their connections with certain parties is entirely based off whatever they have, whatever interaction they have. So to take the Canadian Communist Party, any mail or any memos from the Comintern that they would get would go through New York, because they didn't go directly to Toronto for the first few years because New York was the easier hub to get to. Think about then what that would do for how messages from Moscow might get garbled, take some time, etc. In some cases, you have it where there's a month delay between how the executive committee would contact a communist party. And so there's a lot of sort of hang-ups throughout that entire sort of process. Whereas again, when you have, say, Europe, it's a lot easier to get things to be sent that way. At the same time, you have a number of the governments who are probably watching some of the communications and maybe preventing them from getting delivered at least as cleanly and things like this. So again, while it's this massive unwieldy bureaucracy in a lot of ways, it has a lot of inefficiencies as well.
Which brings us to one of the key questions in the history of Comintern: how independent were individual parties or other members of the Comintern from the executive committee, which had been strongly controlled by the Bolsheviks? And again, I can give an example from my own research. When the Soviet Karelian government started recruiting communist Finns in Canada and the United States, neither the Communist Party of the United States nor the Communist Party of Canada were happy about it, because Finns were the most radical, like single most radical ethnic group in both nations. And as such, at some point, Finns made up almost 45% of the Communist Party of the United States, while being less than 1% of the entire population of the United States. So they were important organizers, they were important financial contributions, and nobody wanted to see them gone.
Yeah.
So it required an intervention from the executive committee of the Comintern. But once that intervention happens, neither of the Communist Party sort of dares to go against that decision. So they started following that. From your perspective, how independent were they, or were they fully dependent?
So it very much depends on the party. So my general approach is, and I understand your students are reading John McElroy and Alan Campbell. So I'll to help them, I would disagree. I generally disagree with some of their positions on the control that Moscow had, or that the Comintern had on member parties. I take the approach of what I've referred to as prioritization. To understand sort of Comintern control, you have to look at two things. One, does it have the ability to actually influence it in any way? So certain parties, it just doesn't know. So let's take South Africa. The first time they really get any real information about what's happening in South Africa on the ground and in the party is really 1927. The same thing for Australia as well. Prior to that, they're just, okay, they'd get some reports. There would be an Australian delegate, for example, around. They might be at some of the congresses. They'd get a bit of information. But it's not until basically someone is in Moscow and delivering a report, and then they go, wait a minute, we need to now look into this more. So like famously in 1926 for the Australian Party, one of the Australian delegates just talking to a couple of Comintern officials, and they ask him, yeah, so by the way, have you done anything on the Aboriginal question? And they're like, we have a few Aboriginals in the party, but that's about it. Oh, you should deal with that. And then that's essentially the most sort of intervention up to that point. Meanwhile, 3 years later, they intervene in the party to remove a few members who are seen as not following the line correctly, and that's how you have sort of the new Stalinized leadership come into play. But they only really deal with the issue of the leadership and the sort of the general line, not so much on issues, for example, of Aboriginal rights and things like that. Because we all think about sort of the United States where you have sort of, and then Canada, Maurice Spector, and who, for example, is basically forced out of the party, helps found the North American Trotskyist movement. Famously, the Comintern gets in and forces him out. And the same thing with virtually every major European or the American party. But in those cases, they care. So this is where the prioritization comes in, because those are the parties that they see as important for their broader mission. So the United States is always important because it's a growing imperial power. Britain's always important because it is the imperial power and remains that way even straight through to the end of the Comintern. France is always seen as important for that same reason. Then you have like interesting things where with the rise of Nazism, Germany's obviously important, but the Dutch and Belgian parties start to get more importance, and the executive committee starts pushing them more in certain directions. This is one reason why anti-colonial work sort of it kind of falls off, is the focus turns to focus on issues at home and preventing the spread of fascism or Nazism. And so when you have that, that's where they intervene more on ideological or theoretical grounds. The place where they really get involved is if there's a leader who's clearly off base. But even then, there's some weird things that happen. So take the Canadian Communist Party. Stuart Smith, who went to the Lenin schools and is considered one of the expert theoreticians, he openly at one point even says the Comintern is wrong. And yet he basically said that the couple of members of the party talk to the Comintern officials and they sit there and say, oh yeah, that's wrong. Here's the correct thing. Reprimand him. They send him to Stuart Smith to the Soviet Union. He comes back 6 months later and remains as a leading member of the party. And so again, there's this weird thing of we have this idea, oh, well, they're clearly against the party, toss them out. That's not the case. And in many cases, like, why doesn't he get tossed out while in South Africa or the United States, you see sort of this purge of members? Part of that is just simply Canada. I make the argument, Canada's just not as important. So they're willing to take a few more chances, especially if the person is a good theoretician or is particularly good at organizing or what have you. So when we're looking at Moscow's control, always ask yourself, to what extent do they see that region or that platform as important? So there's that brief period for racial equality. That's why they go after South Africa, as racial equality becomes one of their big platforms in 28, 29, 30. But other than that, in many cases, the Comintern's willing to let parties sort of do their own thing. Parties have the ability to develop their own platforms, especially if they're not in constant contact with Comintern officials. And even then, the ECCI would send some memos from time to time. But again, the delay would sometimes mean that they would come months after they'd be relevant. For New Zealand, I believe it is, they send a message, hey, you should do this for your upcoming election. They get the message after the election happens. So they can't really do anything with it. But like there's times where I've read documents, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing this. And they say the same thing year after year, and the party just doesn't really react to it because to them, they know the local conditions. So unless the ECCI is going to pull funding or actually send someone to fix the party, they know they have room to operate. And again, the Comintern would only send people in that position if they felt that they either had a serious problem or they cared very deeply about something related to that party.
So to put it in slightly different words, the Comintern is not engaged in micromanagement.
Correct.
They kind of resort to big decisions, but they kind of provide a lot of autonomy to individual parties when it comes to kind of certain concrete policies. What other resources did the Comintern provide its member parties? So you mentioned funding, you mentioned education, and indeed some of the key leaders of the international communist movement, such as Ho Chi Minh, they went through different courses or even universities and got degrees in one of the Moscow-based universities, curated by the Comintern. Was there anything else?
So sometimes it would be just helping them get materials. So one of my favorite examples is the Canadian Communist Party is struggling to reach French Canadian workers in Quebec. So the Comintern says you should focus on getting French Canadian workers, and the Comintern, okay, sure. We don't have anyone who can really speak French, so they said, okay, we'll fix that. They contact the French Communist Party and have them send a whole bunch of materials. The problem is the French Communist movement and the French Canadian workers movement are very different. And on top of that, there's also a degree of animus between Quebec workers and France. So it doesn't quite work. And they have to explain to the Comintern, sorry, thank you, but this doesn't quite work at this way. But that's how sort of the Comintern would also sort of facilitate things by essentially, here, we'll send some materials, we'll provide some of these things to help then solve some of your problems. At the same time, they would also send sometimes the wrong stuff or things that just weren't that helpful. One of the other things that they just do is often, and I think this is more of a sort of a passive thing that they do, but it's something that they certainly are cultivating, is their ability to develop events and bring, especially when they're not as doctrinaire during the third period, and even then, that's starting to be questioned by historians. To what extent is the third period this closing of ranks of communists? Because some parties, for example, are still able, and some members are still able to have really good relationships with non-communists and develop those networks. But when you look at things like the League Against Imperialism or the League Against War and Fascism and a number of these various sort of broad-based movements and parties, the Spanish Civil War comes to mind here, the ability to bring communists in contact with non-communists and to, again, almost put to take it away from the state level and to just have like-minded people discuss and share ideas. That's how a lot of these ideas get spread, and that's how a number of people either join the movement or that they realize, okay, the communist movement's not this evil boogeyman that we need to be worried about in the shadows. And I think that's one of the passive things that the Comintern does that I don't think gets enough attention, at least hasn't until maybe the last decade or so, where just creating the forums for these interactions and for these networks to develop, I think, is one of its lasting legacies. And so while it's always nice to focus on sort of the tangible things, the ideas that they develop, even if they don't really take hold or even if they're criticized for being sort of part of the Comintern milieu or just for whatever reason just don't work in European or world politics, they have these lasting effects that the Comintern helps facilitate.
So in some ways they work like the handler, bringing people together and indeed trying to force new alliances and new connections. That particularly works during the Popular Front period in France, right?
Yeah, and in the United Front prior to it, like there's one of the great sort of counterfactual questions is had the class against class period not started in 28, what would have happened? Because League Against Imperialism, like you look at the names who were involved, Albert Einstein, Jawaharlal Nehru, Madame Sun Yat-sen, these are notable names, and they end up all pulling out at some way, shape, or form just because it becomes too doctrinaire. The Comintern basically forces it to adhere to a more communist doctrine, and that just leads to, like Nehru just says, we're just done. And even though he has a disrespect always for the Bolshevik Revolution and the project that it represented, it's a missed opportunity. And then you look at also all of the individuals who, because the Comintern gets so doctrinaire, especially under Stalin, figures like M.N. Roy, George Padmore, etc., that end up splitting from the movement, leaving the movement altogether. But there's always this degree of respect's not the right word, but that they always look back at their time in the Comintern by saying there was something there worth fighting for, and even if they don't like where it goes. And so you have that sort of situation there where, again, the what could have been, because the United Front period has some really interesting projects like the League Against Imperialism, but then they come back to it with the Popular Front because they realize, okay, they need to focus on this growing threat that is Nazism.
I'm curious about the Comintern activities in Canada. You mentioned that kind of in your dissertation, you look at the three particular questions that were pursued by the Comintern during the interwar period: the national, the colonial, and the racial questions. Yep. And you mentioned that the racial question was not that important for Canada because apparently in comparison to the United States, where it's arguably racial segregation is the most important question of the interwar period. They don't perceive the Aboriginal people, the First Nations of Canada, in those terms, right?
No.
So how do they frame the kind of class struggle in Canada during the interwar period? In national term, in imperial terms?
So it depends on when. So up until 28, it is very much in imperial terms that Canada, though it's a dominion and it has autonomy and self-governing, it is a colony. And so they focus on the English and French Canadian population as the oppressed national groups that require self-determination, which already is one of those moments you just go, there's Aboriginal, there's Indigenous peoples, et cetera. And so you have that problem there. And like just to be the one thing that is common is regarding Indigenous peoples in Canada is they just barely deal with it. It comes down to there is some work being done now on a couple of Métis activists in Western Canada who were members of the party and did at least try to get some support for Indigenous rights, but that's still relatively new research in which we're just now finding, like, being able to dig into it. But other than that, they basically have this general statement of we respect their rights and that they should have the same rights as everyone else. There's still not this idea of self-government that doesn't come until after the Comintern years. Black Canadians, if you're wondering, I did not see any reference to them whatsoever. Asian Canadians, though, and Asian immigrants, for example, are a major issue in BC, in British Columbia. So they are referenced at times about there's much more of a concern in the 1930s, for example, of, especially with Japanese militarism, of trying to bring particularly Chinese immigrants into the movement, but also there's this sort of tension with regards to for example, some Japanese migrants in the area. Are they imperial agents? Are they not? And you have this sort of very simplistic way of sometimes looking at it where that plays a role there. But really for the general, for Canada, the general sort of thing is that French Canada and English Canadians, they are the oppressed peoples. That changes in 28 when the Comintern says, no, Canada is now a secondary imperialist nation because it engages in imperial various imperial opportunities and things like this under the guise of the British Empire. Stop calling for an independent Canada. This is also where there's a growing focus to some degree on French Canada, again, specifically as an oppressed nation, although that comes in fits and starts. And you have this sort of moment where they focus on like RBC's dealings in Cuba and things like this. Like they find small examples of how Canadian imperialism is sort of this evil in the Western Hemisphere. But the idea is that now Canada is now caught between the United States and Britain in terms of whose influence will they operate under. And this is where the Stuart Smith situation I mentioned earlier, where he continues the Canadian independence line. And the Comintern says, no, 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 you're wrong. They're a secondary imperialist nation. Now, funny enough is as the Comintern struggles in the war years, in the Second World War, those old ways of looking at Canada as a colony, as a dependency of Britain, that starts to return in the Second World War. And it gets sort of snuffed out afterwards, but there's this moment where because the Comintern just can't intervene as much, some of those old ideas start to come back up. But again, the focus is almost entirely, if at all, on French Canadians in terms of seeing them as an oppressed people. That said, to mention the Finnish community and the Ukrainian community that are particularly notable in, say, Northern Ontario, making up they are making up the majority of the party. There's this weird relationship where the party realizes they have to keep them happy, but they also are being told repeatedly by the Comintern, become more English, become more French Canadian. So they actually have clashes where they're trying to then, so just to get it to sort of make sure this is clear, the Ukrainian and Finnish communities have their own separate sort of subgroups within the party. These are the language groups. And so they would often have their own publications, their own meetings. They represent their own sort of wing within the party while being sort of subsumed by the broader party itself. And the desire is to end those sort of special rights they have in the party and bring them into the broader English-speaking party. And they fight very much for it because they look at this is just going to break down their networks, break down their ability to have an influence in the party. And eventually the Comintern goes back on what it says and says, nope, we don't worry about this, just leave it be. You don't need to have that fight. And it just becomes one of these weird sources of tension in the party. And then there's like other weird moments with the Ukrainian section. They know about the Holodomor, for example. And so there's this weird time period in the early 30s where they see the Soviet Union, there's this famine happening in Ukraine. They don't fully buy the story they're getting from the Soviet Union, and yet many of them are communists and support the movement. And so you have these weird tensions that come up on national lines that are unique to certain sort of circumstances. But at the same time, Canada is a great example of how certain parts matter a lot more than others. Again, the racial question virtually is non-existent, whereas in other settler colonies, Australia, South Africa, it's a key issue. So,
yeah, it's interesting that during the 1920s and the 1930s, both communist parties of the United States and Canada were actually multilingual parties.
Yep.
Same thing about America. And in fact, some of the most radical presses in Minnesota, for example, or in Michigan, they are Finnish language presses.
Yep.
And they publish a lot of, party literature in the Finnish language in order
Yep.
to cater to this part of the communist movement within CPUSA. Same about some other ethnic groups, like there were Russian language, Ukrainian language party publications. So it's interesting how, again, different that landscape was from the current left-wing movement, which is almost entirely Anglophone, at least outside of Quebec. What were the long-term effects of the Comintern? What were the legacies of the Comintern?
So the one that I focus on, because and I'll preface this by explaining what I was responding to. So Sheila Fitzpatrick wrote this piece in the London Review of Books. So 2017, everybody wrote a book on the Bolshevik Revolution. And you're right, I believe you're reading one in the class, Steve Smith's book, which is one of my favorites from that year. So anyway, so she reviews these, I think it's 5 books, 6 books, I can't remember. And by the end, she basically has this really depressing stance of, well, Steve Smith sort of mentions China, but other than that, the Bolshevik Revolution's kind of done. No one really cares. It has no real legacy. No one really knows what to say about it. And my first thing was, look at Russia's relations with the global South. Look at decolonization. Look at the role that the Comintern played in developing early ways for, like, to go into a little bit of a historiographical sort of dive here. Robin D.G. Kelly, who wrote this originally in 1990 and has updated the book, Hammer and Hoe. Highly recommend the book to anyone who really wants a really good way of looking at a communist party in a specific context in a microhistory. He looks at Alabama communists and how did they reach Black Americans. And he basically makes the argument that Black Americans realized when the Comintern basically tells the CPUSA, you need to start focusing on Black American rights and ending segregation and racial equality, that wins over a number of Black Americans. And then the CPUSA becomes one of the major partners during the 1930s. So the Scottsboro case, and various other these major racially charged moments in American history. Then the CPUSA is on the front line with the NAACP and things like that. And so anyways, what he makes the argument is that on one hand, while the CPUSA is providing a movement that a lot of Black Americans can interact with, a number of Black Americans are using what they learn to reconsider how they view their sort of the oppression of Black Americans in the United States. So, for example, instead of solely looking at it on racial terms, this is where they start to bring in class analysis, and this is where you start to see a Black form of Marxism develop in the Southern United States, and that these are some of those legacies that we don't think about until after the fact. So when you're thinking about civil rights in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, whether it's in the United States or Aboriginal rights movements in Australia or Indigenous rights movements in Canada, or even French Canadian separatism, the communist movement has some influences on all of those. It might not be sort of smack you in the face, but there are some of those arguments where those figures or those ideas get used in different ways. Just even the idea of developing a worldwide network of communist parties that particularly take off in the global South, this all leads to then sort of what happens after the Second World War, where, okay, well, why does Cuba go communist? Why does Ho Chi Minh come to power? What, look, Mao in China, you have those obvious examples, but then also, why is Africa, for example, a hotbed for socialist ideals? Why do you have all of these different figures from Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, etc., Nelson Mandela as well, and his role in the Communist Party is still debated to this day. That you have all of these figures who they're interacting in some way, shape, or form with communist ideas. It might be secondhand. It might be in some cases direct. Jomo Kenyatta out of Kenya. And so that they're at least borrowing some of these that help them develop their post-colonial vision. And I think this is one example, particularly the anti-imperial and the role of racial equality and anti-racism, where there is this legacy. At the same time, and just to make this a little bit more presentist, we're also seeing how that legacy is being used by Russia today to try to ensure the global South stays on its side, or to play to this history of anti-imperialism or anti-racism, when again, that is a very complicated history. And at this, while I sit there and mention all of these legacies, we have to be careful to also note you still have to deal with the problem of the Soviet Union's own potentially imperial efforts within its own borders. You have to also deal with the fact that as the work of some people like Jeff Sahadeo, and the work of, and even some of the memoirs that we have of Black Americans that end up coming to the Soviet Union, there's this hope that initially happens, but by the end, they realize that there is things like racism in the Soviet Union, just in a different way. Yet, that anti-racism is something that has sort of, again, it's that double-edged sword. On one hand, it represented an alternate path to American liberalism and its treatment of the African-American population. At the same time, they've then used that to perhaps not deal with some of their own problems. So things like that.
Well, thank you very much. I promised you it will be a 45-minute conversation, and I think we exceeded it by 3 minutes already. But I think it was a good conversation. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me.